And that's not the only case of excessive force that we are hearing about today. A few hours north of Los Angeles, a U.S. district judge has ruled that police officers must face excessive force claims coming out of Occupy Oakland. The protesters claim the police used unusually harsh tactics to disperse a peaceful group of activists who were speaking out against tuition hikes at the University of California, Berkeley. The Berkeley police used their batons to beat protesters who had linked arms in order to avoid eviction. Meanwhile, in New York, Occupy activist Michael Primo was found innocent of assaulting a police officer when a video evidence directly contradicted a New York Police Department officer who was under oath. Here to discuss the case of Mr. Primo and other instances of police recklessness, I'm joined now by Matthew Feeney. He's the assistant editor for Reason 24/7. Matthew, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Let's talk about these different cases that we're seeing. Is there a trend kind of going on? Are these the exception, or are they really the standard?
Well, I think what we're really seeing is that there is a trend in the use of excessive force by police throughout the country. And I think that this is something that, is not isolated to the instances you just highlighted. It's actually something that is continued over the last few years.
Okay, so the LAPD certainly has a reputation of police brutality, but we've seen this increased militarization of local police forces, across the country, from tanks to SWAT teams to the gear that they use, etc. How does this affect the relationship between the police and the civilian population?
Well, it affects it really dramatically. It's really interesting that we are starting to treat or arm our police in the same way that we arm and train our military. And the military is designed and used by countries to find, isolate, and eliminate enemies. The point of a police force is to protect the rights of citizens. And the second that you start treating police or arming police like soldiers, it should be no surprise that citizens start feeling like enemies in a war zone. The fact is that what we want to have is a police force that people can look up to, where people feel safe, but as we just saw in California, actually, citizens are more often, or very often, the receiving end of brutality.
Do you think that we're setting ourselves up with this increased kind of militarization for a square-off, basically, between police and civilians? I mean, the police are supposed to protect the civilians, but it more and more seems like with these tactics they are coming against the civilians, does it not?
Right, exactly. And I think, I don't want to phrase it just that, civilians are the only ones at risk. The irony of this is that police officers are very often putting themselves at risk by using these tactics, right? And it shouldn't be a surprise when citizens push back, but it is also very often seen in instances like no-knock raids, where police will regularly bash into people's property without, very, very quick alarm in the middle of the night. And, until it's made aware of what's happening, most people in their homes assume that masked men with automatic weapons are storming their house, and they respond violently oftentimes. So it shouldn't, we should continue to expect these sort of things to happen as long as police keep behaving like soldiers.
So what can the civilian population do to protect themselves, really? I mean, in both Occupy instances that we highlighted a little bit earlier, the reason that these people were exonerated in the end was because there was video evidence. Is that the only solution, or is there something else civilians could do?
Well, it's a very powerful tool that, thankfully, technology is allowing us to have, right? Which is that we have cell phones, and cameras are very cheap. So it's very, very important that people realize that they have tools to their disposal that they can oftentimes use, although different states have different jurisdictions about laws about filming police. But another side of this is just education. People, I think too often civilians are made to feel that the police are always superior, but it's important that people actually know their rights and know that everything a policeman does is not necessarily justified or legal.
Okay, so let's talk about the three cases that we covered a little bit earlier, as I mentioned. Do you think that this is something that should be handled by local authorities, or should it be a nationwide discussion of what's going on?
Well, I think legally, I'm not a lawyer, but I imagine that it should be treated locally and then work its way through the court system. But I think it has to be part of a national discussion, because police brutality is not something isolated to major cities like Los Angeles or New York. It's happening in towns across many states across the country where police are using excessive force.
Okay, and finally, let's talk about the testimonies that these police officers put out. Now, obviously, Michael Primo, the police officer in that instance, said that he was very violent toward him, and that was the reason that they arrested him. But should we put so much stock into police officers' testimonies? I mean, in an article, opinion piece that I just read today, it says the San Francisco Police Commissioner wrote an article saying that police officers are commonly accused of perjury, and they're also guilty of perjury. So should we just trust police officers at face value?
No, I think when anyone appears in a court and takes an oath to tell the truth, that it should carry equal weight, whether you're a policeman or a civilian. Now, like I said earlier, technology and footage is allowing it to become more difficult for police officers to actually lie under oath. But that's something that can happen whether police are militarized or not, that police can lie. But I feel by no means that because someone's a police officer, we should give them any sort of special treatment when they're under oath.
So when in doubt, find the evidence to prove something's going on.
As always.
All right. Assistant editor at Reason 24/7, Matthew Feeney, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.